Welcome back to my YouTube series where I cover each of the parts of the Palo Alto Network's next generation firewall engineer certification. I am still on section 1.5, which is Global Protect. And today we will be talking about Global Protect portals. I've received a lot of feedback from my viewers that you've said that you'd like the videos to be a little bit shorter and therefore you would like me to break up the videos more. So I'm happy to do that. And so today I'm only going to cover the section on portals, which is a subsection of 1.5 on Global Protect. So if you are studying for the Palo Alto Network's next generation firewall engineer, you've come to the right place. Let's begin. You can think of the Global Protect portal as the first access point that you are going to reach as a user trying to access Global Protect. And it really provides you two things. So first, it provides a web application which a user can use to download the VPN client. In that web application, there is also a feature called clientless VPN, where you're going to have this web application, and then it will list other applications. And basically, if you try to access one of those applications, the clientless VPN can proxy your connection into an internal or even external web application for you. If you'd like to learn more about the clientless VPN, because I'm not going to cover it in depth today, I have an entire video on that, so you can go watch that video on my channel. I think it is one of the top videos on YouTube about the clientless VPN. So that is one of the features of the Global Protect portal, is this kind of web application where you can download your client or access the clientless VPN. The other thing that the portal does for you is it's basically an app settings delivery mechanism. So after you actually download that client and install it, which is the client is just a set of software that's running on your endpoint. I've heard some people call it the fat client. It's very common. Once you install it and you're actually trying to log in to Global Protect, it's going to first point you to the portal, and it's going to contact the portal, pull down client settings, which we're going to go through today. And in those client settings, it'll include the gateways, and the gateways are what it's going to connect to next in order to actually get that VPN functionality that you know and love, which is the actual ability to access internal servers or to get firewall security through things like URL filtering, etc., when accessing the internet. So that is the value of the portal, and that's really how you can kind of think of it as this first access point. It'll make a lot more sense once we actually see the settings in the firewall itself. But remember, if you've never actually configured a Global Protect portal before, I did make a video before this, the part 1, and so please go watch that if you've never configured a Global Protect portal before, because I will be using the settings that I configured there, and also a lot of things that I say will make more sense if you've at least done it once before. Anyway, let's switch over to the firewall, and here you can see the same environment that I've been using for most of my demonstration videos, which is a virtual firewall in Amazon Web Services. Many of you in the comments have asked me to show how I set this up, so I am definitely planning a series in building your own Palo Alto Networks lab in Amazon Web Services. Please continue to follow my channel, click subscribe if you would like, and I will be putting out more good content like that for those of you who are interested in learning Palo Alto Networks as well as cybersecurity in general. All right, so if you want to see the Global Protect portal settings in your firewall, you're going to go to Network, and under Global Protect, you'll hit Portals. This is, as I mentioned, the portal I configured in the previous video. I am just going to go through all of the settings so that you understand them. First, we have the general settings, which has the name of the portal as well as the network settings, specifically for the interface and IP address where we are exposing Global Protect. Global Protect portal will always use port 443 on this interface. There is a tricky way to use network address translation if you need to expose a different port, but whatever interface you select here, it is going to expose only 443, and that will make up the entire socket of the Global Protect portal. You can also select a loopback or VLAN interface as you see. In my case, I have Ethernet 1.1, which is a virtual interface. It is simulating a physical interface, but is a virtual interface because I'm using a VM series. You can select IPv4, IPv6, and you can also use dual stack with Global Protect if you are using dual stack in your environment. Here you'll select the IP address, and I have the CIDR notation as well. All right, moving on to appearance. I will not cover this in depth because, and this is hopefully a good tip for all of you who are preparing for your Global Protect certification, for your next generation firewall engineer certification. Generally, these people, I've met them. I've helped write one of the certifications, as you all know, the network security analyst. If you've taken that certification or if you plan to, some of the questions there will be ones that I've written. I've read every single question that's on that certification. And I know, and some of the people who I wrote this with were also authors of the Next Generation Firewall Engineer certification. I was not an author of this certification, but I know those people, and I promise you they are hard networking people, and they care about real-world networking problems that you will be solving with the Palo Alto Networks firewall, networking and security problems. They are I promise you, most of these people are very, very unlikely to select to create any kind of question that is going to relate to something like a response page. So if you're looking to how you want to prioritize your study, I would not worry too much about response pages, worry much more about the actual technical functionality of Global Protect. That would be my strong recommendation. I have a video where I customize one of these response pages, then I show where that's done. You can select them here. They're an XML file, and you can customize these specific pages. I think these are very intuitive. One is the login page, which is before your users log in. After they log in to this web page, again, this is specific to the web page that you can pop up. You will not see these things if you are only using the client. The landing page, and then the app help page. So if you have a specific help page that you configure, then you can select that as well. All right, moving on to log settings. These log settings are very, very similar to those in a security policy. You can log a successful SSL handshake, which is off by default because you wouldn't want to log every single successful SSL handshake. But it is a good idea to log unsuccessful SSL handshakes, which is on by default, so that you can debug any SSL handshake errors that you might be having. If you'd like to forward those logs instead of only having them local on the firewall, you can select a log forwarding profile, which is going to be the same type of profile which would be used in a security policy. In fact, if you already have one selected for a security policy, you can use that. Otherwise, you'll need to configure it, and it will use the same 4 log forwarding formats, methods, which are available in the Palo Alto Networks firewall: SNMP, email, syslog, and HTTP. That is all I'm going to say on log settings. Moving on to authentication, I will make an entire video on authentication where I'll talk specifically about these authentication profiles and how they work. But here I'm just going to walk through the authentication settings within the Global Protect portal. First, you see server authentication. This is where you are going to configure the certificate, which is presented by the Global Protect endpoint. As you recall, I said that the default port is 443, and it will always be a TLS. It will always present TLS. It's going to use the certificate for TLS that you put in this SSL TLS profile. You'll need to add a certificate here and select the minimum and maximum version that you will allow for the connection, as well as the key exchange algorithms that you will allow. In some cases, maybe for example, you don't like AES 128 and you want it to only be 256, then you can unselect those, and therefore you will be locking down your encryption algorithms to only these particular ones that you have selected. You will need to select a certificate here as well, and the private key of that certificate is what will be used to communicate with the client, and the certificate that is there with that certificate is what will be presented to the client. All right, moving on to, actually before I move on, if you don't understand what I mean with private key and all of that, please let me know. I'm actually teaching a Security Plus class right now, and I am interested if any of my viewers are interested in some of the more basics of certificates, and I'm happy to make a video on how certificates, public key infrastructure, signing, private keys, what I mean by all of that. If you don't understand those things or you want to learn more about them, please let me know in the comments, and I'm happy to make a video on that. Moving on to client authentication. Client authentication is going to be logging in both for that web application that I talked about. So if you are logging in via the web, then it's going to, the login that you use is going to be using this client authentication profile here. But this will also be used by your client after you download the client. So it's kind of confusing, but after you download the software for Global Protect, when it first accesses the portal, in fact, every time it accesses the portal, it's going to use the client authentication settings that you specify here. All right, so let me look at what I had configured in the previous video. As you can see, I just configured use local database for all operating systems. You can specify per operating system. So for example, if I call this Android, that would require me to learn to spell, and then I select Android here, and then I clone, and I call this Windows. Now, if a client tries to log in, it will detect its operating system. If it is Android, it will use this operating system, or use these, client authentication settings. And if it detects the operating system as Windows, it will use these ones, which are specified here under Windows. This authentication profile, I configured local database, which, as I mentioned in the previous video, is a set of usernames and password hashes, not hashword passes, password hashes that are stored on the firewall itself. That's why it's a local database of users and their password hashes. I will make a whole video on authentication profiles, so don't worry too much about this right now. You have the ability to automatically retrieve passcode from soft token applications, which is used very commonly with people who use RSA. So if you want the users to be able to enter their RSA PIN directly into Global Protect when they are logging in, then you can select this, and that would be the use case for that. Global Protect has the ability for you to use the default browser. This is kind of confusing because Global Protect by default does not use the default browser. By default, it uses the embedded browser. The embedded browser is a browser that is built into the Global Protect client itself. So if you are logging in with the Global Protect client, then it will use the embedded browser by default, and this will not be selected. If, however, you wanted to use the default browser, so say, for example, for some reason, the identity provider that you are using does not work well with the embedded browser in Global Protect, you can use the default browser. And now it will have you use the default browser of the system that you are logging in with. So for example, in Windows, you can set your default browser. You might want to set it to be Prisma Access Browser or to be Chrome, whichever you set it to, that is what it's going to log in with. So if this authentication profile here, and we'll make a video on this, if you're using something like Microsoft Entra to log in, then once your users go to, I believe it would be like live.com, but it would be some Microsoft website that it's going to point them to actually log in with their Microsoft credentials, then it will pop that up either in the embedded browser or the default browser. If you don't select this, it will be the embedded browser. If you select this, it will be the default browser of the system. I hope that makes sense. Moving on, we are talking about the app login screen. Again, this is very aesthetic, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. But if you wanted to change the username label, for example, to corporate email, because you have your users log in with their corporate email as their username, then you can do that here to customize that and make it a little bit easier for your users. Finally, this section here allows you to force someone to log in both with this authentication profile here as well as with a client certificate, which you will need to ensure is installed on that endpoint. By default, this is actually no, which is a little bit confusing because no it means yes, but no means and, so it means it needs to be both the user credentials and the client certificate. Note that if you have or here, it's or, so it's either this or a client certificate. If you select no here, so let's say for Windows, we want them to log in with these user credentials as well as they have to present a valid client certificate. Then we will need to select this certificate profile here, and here we will need to add the certificate authority that has a certificate of the certificate authority that has signed the certificate that is presented to Global Protect. So if you have and here, you definitely need to have a certificate profile here. If you have or here, you can also have a certificate profile here if you want your users to be able to log in just with their certificate and not enter user credentials, which you can do to lower friction, especially for managed devices. You can do that. So that is how that works. So if you want a user to be able to log in with a client certificate, again, if you want to log in with their username, you're going to have to put subject here, and then within that certificate, their username will have to be the subject common name. And then that certificate that's presented will have to have been signed by a CA certificate that you put here. All right, so that is how client authentication works. It's important to know this no thing here is by default. So if you are using that, then you need to make sure that one, your clients have the client certificate installed, and two, you've put the certificate profile here of the CA, which is signing any of those client certificates. Moving on to portal data collection. There's a couple settings here. So first, if you want to use a certificate for configuration selection, so basically if you want to have, say you have a set of certificates on endpoints that are for admin users, and you only want the admin users to be able to get the admin settings if they have an admin client certificate installed. Then you can put a certificate profile here, which will get that certificate that can be used for configuration selection. Note that if you want to do that, you have to select it here, but you have to select it somewhere else as well. This just basically says, okay, do I even want to pull that certificate at all, right? And same thing here for custom checks. So this does not enforce anything with registry keys. This just says, do I even want to pull these registry keys and send them to the portal at all? Why do you have to do this? Because you don't want to just automatically send all of these certificates, and you don't want to automatically send all of the registry keys. You need to specify which ones, and so you need to specify the certificate profile for any certificates that you're trying to send, and you need to specify the any registry keys that you want to capture to be used later. Specifically, it's usually going to be used in a host information profile, but you're actually going to see in a second how you can also use a registry key also for configuration selection. So if you're checking registry keys either for configuration selection or for a host information profile, you need to specify any registry keys that you want to capture here. And same thing if you're using a property list. So Mac, that's basically the registry key of Mac, is something called the property list. You will need to do the same thing here as well. All right, moving on to agent. I'll go through the detailed agent settings in a second. First, if you want to specify a trusted root CA, specifically a root certificate authority that your endpoint might not trust by default, this is going to be very, very common if you have some kind of a certificate internal, like a corporate certificate that maybe is used for your internal applications, but would not be trusted by a general user out there. So it's not going to be signed by sort of a publicly well-known CA that, like Google Trust Services or something like that anybody would trust. It's just something that only people within your company, or root certificate authority, only people in your company are going to trust. Then you would want to put that here. And after you add it, you can actually also have it installed in the local root certificate store, so it'll actually install on the machine itself. As well as there is another setting here for agent user override key, and this is basically if you want to have the ability to submit a ticket to override the agent, then you want to require the user to input a password, then you can put that password here, and that will allow that ticket functionality to work. Let's go through more of the details of the agent configuration itself. Here you can see that the agent configuration has a name. This allows you to install a client certificate. This might be common if you wanted the client certificate to be able to log you into the gateway, for example. So if after someone logs into Global Protect, you want it to download a specific certificate that then it will install for that user. And then be able to be used elsewhere for authentication, you can do that. So it says selected client certificate will be installed on client machines. Note that this is different from back here where we're installing a certificate authority, which will be used, which will be trusted when applications are signed by that certificate authority. This is just a client authentication, so this will be installed on the machine as a client certificate, which can be used to authenticate the client itself. Here you can determine whether or not you want to save user credentials. You have some simple options: no, yes, save only the username and only with the user fingerprint. This section for authentication override, this is very, very common. I would make sure you understand the basics of how this works. Basically, you can generate a cookie for authentication override or accept a cookie for authentication override, which means that the entire authentication will be overridden if it has the proper cookie, which is signed by whatever certificate you select here. More commonly though, you will not accept here, you will actually generate at the portal, and then you will select the certificate, and then you will select the same certificate in the gateway, and I'll show this in the next lesson where I talk about gateways. And then that will basically keep you from having to log in twice. You won't have to log in the portal and then the gateway. The portal will generate this cookie, which will then get passed to the gateway, and then the gateway authentication will happen in the background because it will see the encrypted cookie encrypted with this same certificate. Very, very common. I would definitely understand the basics of how that works, at least with generating in the portal and accepting in the gateway, because that's very, very common in order to keep people from having to log in twice. Here, the Palo Alto allows you to kind of force two-factor authentication on portal, internal gateways, external and external gateways. And I'll explain the difference between internal and external gateways in a second. All right, so much like the authentication from before, authentication configuration from before, for the actual configuration selection, you can actually do this per operating system as well. So for example, if I want to call this Android, I'm just going to do it the same way I did before so you can see it, Android. And then for the operating system, I select Android. Okay, and then I clone, and then I call this Windows. Select Windows. All right. Now look, it's going to select the agent configurations for any client. When the client logs in with Android, it's going to say, okay, my OS is Android, so therefore I get these configurations for my agent. And if I log in with Windows, I get these configurations for my agent. You can also do this with users, so you can have different users get different configurations as we discussed before. This might be common if you have admin users that you want to have. Basically, maybe they need more access for some reason. They need to be able to disconnect for longer or something based on troubleshooting, however you want to do that. If you want to change those settings, then you can do that. All right, moving on. Device checks. Again, note that these are for configuration selection criteria. So if you want to only have these specific app settings pulled, if there is a machine account that exists with a device serial number, then you select yes, and then it will basically read that device serial number. Note that I've seen people here on Reddit run into issues when they select no, because the machine account exists with device security number, and then this evaluates to false, right? Because it does exist, and then therefore these configs are not selected. Note that you can run into issues if you do that, because if I go back, you actually need one of these to match. If one of these doesn't match, you're going to get an error. I've gotten this error several times where it says it can't find a valid agent configuration because it doesn't match one of these things. So be careful with these configuration selection criteria, because if you need to make sure that at least one matches for your valid users. All right, moving on to machine certificate check. So remember, it says machine certificate check, right? Remember here, I said certificate profile for configuration selection. So if you want to use a certificate for configuration selection, you're going to select here the certificate profile, which would have all of the CAs that could sign any of the certificates which are presented by the machine for any configuration selection. Now here in this specific one, you're going to want to put, a certificate profile which is signed by the certificate authorities which are specific to this particular settings. So for example, maybe you have a set of certificates which are signed by like admin CA, and that admin CA only signs the admin client certificates, and these app settings are for admins, for administrators. Then you're going to make a new certificate profile called like admin CA profile. This is one of those ones that only allows you to do dashes. Some of these don't like spaces. And then you're only going to add the CA here for which has signed those admin certificates that might be presented, if that makes sense. All right. Moving on to custom checks. So these custom checks, again, are part of config selection criteria. So these are only, you do not need to add these to be able to read registry keys. That was done before, and we're actually going to have to do it again in a second. But here, this basically says, for this registry key, if this registry key exists, or if it has this data, then you can select these app settings, right? So if I put a registry key here and it does not exist, then, or it is not in that system, then these app settings will not be selected. You can also negate it here. You can say the key does not exist. So you can write a key and then it will only select these app settings if that key does not exist. You can also negate the value. So you can put the value data here and you can select negate. So if it's anything other than that value, then it will select these app settings. So there's there's very, very granular here how many things you can select to basically determine whether or not to select these app settings or a different set of app settings. Same thing with property lists if you're using Mac. Moving on. Internal host detection. So you can select internal gateways. It will actually if you add an internal gateway, it will try to connect to the internal gateways first, and if it can't reach the internal gateways, then it will move to the external gateways. That's how that works by default. If you want to sort of prevent it from doing that, you can do this thing where you put in an internal host detection. So you put in like an IP address where you say like 192.168.2.50. I hate, you guys are gonna hate me about .67, and say that is like your 67.wesleycyber.local. Say that this host name should resolve to this IP address. You can put this here. It will basically do an NS lookup, and if this matches, then it knows, okay, I'm on an internal host, right? So these things should resolve. And then here you can put the internal gateways. You can also specify a source address range if you want to do that. So you can put like 192.168.2.0/24. And then this will specify the source address for your, it's making me do both. It's making me do both. All right, for your like vpn.wesleycyber.local. All right, internal gateway. All right, so these are ways to basically lock down your internal gateway so that it's not always trying to access it, but it will try to access any valid internal gateway first. If it can't access it, then it will proceed to the external gateways. External gateways, most people I've seen are just using external gateways. You would use an internal gateway if sort of inside your environment you still want the security mechanisms of Global Protect. So for example, if you're validating registry keys using Global Protect to do that, and you still want people to have Global Protect on validating registry keys, even when they're inside your environment, then you can use internal gateways to do that. External gateways will be for people outside your environment, and you can see here I've already configured an external gateway. You can do it based on source region, country, do prioritize based on country and source region. Here I put the FQDN. You can allow users to manually select gateways. And you can also select third-party VPNs, which I'm not going to cover right now. All right, moving on. Let's go to app configurations. There are a lot of app configurations here, so I am not going to show all of these. There are a couple that I do want to show, mostly the ones that are associated with these things here. So one, you can see that if you want to allow disconnect from Global Protect app, then you can go here, allow user to disconnect from Global Protect app. And if you allow with passcode, then now you can put a passcode here that matches. You can set the max number of times that the user can disconnect, and then a disconnect timeout, which is very common. So basically what that means is if you put like 120 here, now when the user disconnects, even with that passcode, it will only allow them to do that with for like 2 hours. You can actually put this here. So even if you just do allow, it will still do, you can still put the timeout there. So when the user disconnects, it'll reconnect them automatically after 2 hours. Of course, they can just re-disconnect, but if you want to kind of like encourage them to stay connected, that's a way to do that. All right, same thing with uninstall. If you want to allow with password, you need to put that password here. So then they would have to reach out to IT to get that password to uninstall if they needed to do that. Finally, if you have a mobile security manager, note that this would be like your IP of your mobile security manager. If you're using the Palo Alto Network's mobile security manager, if you're using like a GP100 device, if you don't know what that is, then you're not going to configure this, but this is specific to Palo Alto Network's mobile security manager, and connecting it to that, then you can put that here. There are tons and tons of settings here: always on, pre-log on demand, manual user initiated. So this is specific connect method. You know, how often, so I mentioned before, right? How often does the app config refresh? So it's going to reach, how often is it going to reach back to the portal and get new app configurations? By default, it's going to be 24 hours, but you can make it shorter. As short as every 1 hour. You can display specific reasons. If they want to disconnect, you can give them reasons. There's just a lot of things here. I can't go through all of these. You can feel free to look through these if you want to kind of make sure you're familiar with them before proceeding to your certification exam. Moving on. So again, we talked about host information profiles for something like validating registry keys. I have a video on validating registry keys, so go check that out. If you want to collect tick data, make sure this is checked. How long, but this is the maximum wait time. It'll wait before to get all that data, so it gives it 20 seconds to get all the data. If you want to validate a specific certificate, if certificates is part of your host information profiles, you have a host information profile object for a certificate, then you'll need to put another certificate profile here, which is going to have the CA of any certificate that you want to pull, that you want to collect. You can exclude, you can do some exclusion here. So if you want to, all right, it's not populating, but you can, oh yeah, you have to select a vendor, that's why. No, doesn't, all right, doesn't feel like it's helping me out. Anyway, if you want to exclude specific categories, you can do that. So that basically means, hey, there's specific things I don't want to collect. In my video on validating registry keys, I show here how you have to do this. But if you want to collect registry keys, you're going to have to add the registry keys here in addition to where we collected them before. So you have to add 2 places. I don't know why, but you have to add it in both places, both there as well as in the specific app config where you configure it. So add it here as well, the key and the value, as I mentioned before. If you want to get a list of processes, then you'll need to put that list here as well. And then with your property list, same thing, processes, and then with Linux, you just have process. So if you're pulling processes, property lists, or registry keys, you're going to need to put those things here if you want to use those later for your host information profile objects. All right. What if I go here? All right. Let's just hit cancel. All right, I already explained these. Moving on to client-less VPN, as I mentioned, I already have a video on client-less VPN, so check out that video if you want to learn more about client-less VPN. And last, there is this satellite configuration. I will explain the satellite configuration a little bit, but I am not going to walk through a full satellite configuration. This is actually something Palo Alto Networks calls a large-scale VPN configuration. Basically, what this is if you want to set up Global Protect to serve as a kind of like a hub and spoke architecture where you have other firewalls. So say you have sites which are going to be like your spokes, and in those sites you want to set up a tunnel to each of those sites to a hub that you have, so that kind of all the traffic is there. So for example, maybe you want to use it like you want to use your firewall like a VPN router. And so then if you have like a remote site and then you want that remote site to connect into the main hub, then you can set up this large scale VPN configuration. In the hub firewall, which is being used as the hub for your Global Protect connection, this is where you're going to configure this satellite. You will not configure this on the spokes. I'll show you in a second where you configure the spokes. But you're going to add here all the information of the devices, the serial number, host name, the users that can log in, the gateways, etc. I'm not going to go into the details here, but you're going to have to add in each satellite here. And then under IPsec tunnels, you can even see satellite. You can add here, there it is, Global Protect satellite. And so then on the spoke, you're going to select this, and then you're going to put the portal address of the portal where you have configured satellite as on that portal where you've configured it here, if that makes sense. I'm not explaining this in super depth because it is a bigger concept. If you would like to see a whole video on the large scale VPN, then let me know, but I don't think that's should be your primary focus as you're preparing for this certification exam. All right, I have covered everything in the portal. That actually even ended up being a pretty long video because there are a ton of settings in the portal. So let's come back out of the firewall, and as a review, I covered all of the settings in the portal. I covered how to authenticate to the portal. I covered some specific settings that you need to for portal data collection, how to pull specific data such as certificates and registry keys and property lists if you're using Mac. I covered tons and tons of agent settings, and yeah, there's just a lot of agent settings in there. You don't need to know all of them, just make sure you know the key ones that are in there. I did not cover in depth the clientless VPN. Feel free to go watch my video on the clientless VPN, and I explained the large scale VPN a little bit, but if you'd like to see a video on large scale VPN, then please go do that. If you are finding this information helpful, please let me know in the comments if there's anything I can do to make these videos better. Also, please let me know in the comments. I find your feedback very, very valuable, and it helps me continue to make these videos better. As you all know, I have been looking into ways to actually protect your VPN, and I have been working on something which will working with a tool that will help you secure your VPNs if that's something that interests you. I will put a link for that in the description below, and look for a future video on how to protect your specific VPN, because in general, I'll put in the description below also my experiment, but I did an experiment where I opened a Global Protect portal to the world, and basically it was accessed, you know, hundreds and hundreds of times a day from tons of different VPNs. I think over 60 days it was accessed over 100,000 times from 7,000 different VPNs. Might have been almost 200,000 times. I'll put the full research in the description. But in order to prevent that, I started using a tool called Vesper Secure. So I'm going to put the link for Vesper Secure in the description below if you're interested in how to protect your VPN. If not, no worries. Just continue to watch these lessons as I continue to prepare you for the Palo Alto Networks Next Generation Firewall certification. In the next video, we are going to cover gateways. So I will see you then.